I want to thank just quickly Tom Collin and Jerry Hobden who worked with us to help this take place. So I just want to say thank you to both of them who are here. Thank you for helping. And I know that there's several people in here that have requested this type of meeting and pushed for it. So again, thank you so much. So I'm going to start with Mitzi Hunter. Mitzi Hunter is one of my colleagues at the Ontario Legislature. She represents Scarborough-Guildwood and is the former Minister of Education. She was the minister responsible for our colleges and universities, and also responsible for the reform for our pension. She was the Associate Finance Minister, and she's the critic, the Liberal critic for finance. Mitzi, welcome to Don Valley East. I'll just go through, and then I'll just go back to you. Okay, and next we have Dennis Pilon, and he is a professor at York University. I'd like to thank you for being here this evening, and again, welcome to Don Valley East. We have Sylvia Bashevkin, and she's also a professor, but at the University of Toronto. And last is Frank Grossman, and he is very passionate on this issue. He is also a member of the Citizen Climate Lobby, but he's here representing his own views this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to Mitzi to say a few words, and we'll pass it along, and then we'll start with the first question. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you for organizing this panel. And it's really great to see the interest in this room in electoral reform and how alive this issue is in our democracy in Ontario and in our city. So my name is Mitzi Hunter. I'm the MPP for Scarborough-Guildwood, and I was elected 5 years ago in 2013 for the first time. It was the first time I ran. It was the first time I signed up actually for a political party, and I was elected in that by-election. I've since run in 3 elections and have won all 3. I have to say the last one was really tough, and boy, do I appreciate the value of that voter. And every voter I see in my community now, I sort of hug them and say thank you for electing me. When I stepped into the role as the MPP for Scarborough-Guildwood, it was very natural for me in my first private member's bill to take on local electoral reform. And my first private member's bill was on ranked ballot for municipal elections. And this was for the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto had asked for the ability to do that, and I felt that the province should change the Toronto Act, the City of Toronto Act, and give the cities the power to do that. And so I vigorously debated the bill, and it passed second reading. But of course, in 2014, the general election was called, so of course all the bills die, and my bill did not see third reading. But the Liberal Party actually included ranked ballots in the platform for that election, for the 2014 general election. And when we won a majority government, Ted McMeekin was the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and he actually brought this forward in 2016 to become law in Ontario, that municipalities, not just Toronto, in fact, it was expanded to all municipalities. So all municipalities had the opportunity to conduct a ranked ballot election for their mayor and their councils. And but it doesn't stop there, right? As you know, electoral reform is about citizen engagement. And you can have the law on the books, but if citizens don't pick up that law and make it a reality, it doesn't happen. London, Ontario, took up the call, passed it in their council, and guess what? They are the first municipality, first government in Ontario, in Canada, to use the ranked ballot system. And it worked. They elected their council. It's actually, many new faces are on their council. and they're moving forward. So it was really wonderful to see that. There were also a number of referendums in the past municipal election. I know Cambridge voted yes to try the rank balance system as well. But I do believe in electoral reform, particularly at the local level. I don't believe that someone should be voted in at 17% and then speak for all of the people in their area.
Well, thanks for having me come out to this event, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a Tuesday night. I'm sure there was something good on television, but here you are, right? So that's great. That's dedication. I love to see that. My expertise is on this specific question, voting systems, how they work, and how they get changed. So I'm very much interested in the politics of the question, because when we look at this historically and comparatively, a lot of what you've heard is bunk. It's not about values, it's not about performance, it's all about politics. It's all about who wins and who loses, and to what extent the public or a democratic will can push gatekeepers and push traditional power holders to grant more space, because it does come at a cost. It comes, the current system works in a certain way that benefits certain people, and they don't want it to change. And they'll fight like hell to keep it. We were seeing this out in British Columbia, where a very well-financed group is attempting to use the courts to derail the referendum process there. They tried to get an injunction to stop it. That failed. They went to an appeal. That failed. They have a court case to have the whole thing set aside in the event it were to pass. So you get a sense when this kind of money is being spent and when millionaires are wrapping the newspaper with their ads, that something very important is at stake. So it's crucial that we understand that. So I've spent about 30 years studying this topic. I've written a book, The Politics of Voting, Reforming Canada's Electoral System, that focuses on the case for Canada and the experience in Canada.
Very good book.
Thank you. He'll get his check in the mail. I have another book, Wrestling with Democracy, Voting Systems and Politics in the 20th Century West, looks at 18 countries over 150 years, every instance of national voting system reform across countries that are very similar to Canada. And so I can draw out some lessons from that for you tonight. But in these introductory comments, I didn't bring a presentation. I'm excited to see what's coming next. But in our question and answers, I hope you really hit us up with some tough questions, because I really do think that we should have a fact-based discussion about this kind of stuff. And this topic, I think, if we were to compare it to other policy areas, man, does it drive a lot of fake news. There's an awful lot of claims that are made that are never supported, never backed up. So I will just leave you, with this insight. When we compare Canada to other countries that are like Canada, right? So you don't compare us to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe uses the same voting system we do. Gee, I wonder, right? I mean, that would be a ridiculous comparison to compare us to Zimbabwe. They're obviously a very different country. The fact they use the same voting system in no way tells us very much about what we might expect from our voting system. And yet it's the same kind of ridiculous comparisons that we hear people make, comparing Canada to Israel or to Italy, or countries that have very, very different political and economic histories to ours. So what we can say in making comparisons across countries that do look like Canada is that proportional systems work, that they are seen to be fair, that their publics like them, that they get results. So, if you don't like PR, fine. Just come out and say it. But don't try to wrap it in a whole bunch of lies and misinformation about what will happen if we use these systems. Because the track record over the past century is that the PR systems work pretty well in most of the places that are using them. And one can find examples of bad behavior amongst all the different systems. So let's get into some of those details tonight and see the things that you want to talk about.
My name is Sylvia Bashevkin. I teach political science at the University of Toronto. I want to thank Michael for organizing an evening that's a political scientist's dream, of course, and Andrew for inviting me. So I've got a very, very brief PowerPoint here that uses data from something called the Interparliamentary Union. Some of you may know it's an international organization that collects data, and in particular, I want to pay attention to a subject that I've studied since I was a graduate student in the 1970s, which is women's political representation. So many of you know that women represent roughly half of the world's population. Women represent roughly half the population of all diverse groups, whether we're talking about racial minorities, ethnocultural minorities, sexual orientation minorities, immigrants to Canada, and so on. So what I want to point out here is if we scroll down, Andrew, and we go down all the way, I believe, to something like number 60 on the world rankings, if we go down very, very far on this list, there we find Canada at number 61. So Canada ranks 61st in the world in the representation of women in our federal parliament, just in case we were feeling very self-satisfied. I want to point out that if we start to look at the list upward between number 1 and number 61, we will see that most major liberal democratic systems, and like Dennis, I want to focus here on countries that are like our own, that have a long history of liberal democratic rules and democratic elections. Most major liberal democratic systems that are ahead of Canada have either full proportional representation or mixed proportional representation systems. So you can see here, this includes countries like Sweden and Finland and Norway. The countries of Northern Europe are known to have roughly half women in their parliaments. They have high representations of women in their cabinets and in very top cabinet jobs, including as finance ministers and as foreign ministers. The exception here among liberal democratic systems is probably France. France has legislated quotas for women candidates. In other words, parties in France are required to run proportions of women candidates. So what I want to point out here is that if we compare ourselves to similar systems, we are very low on the rankings, and we tend to be very far behind countries that either have full proportional representation or mixed proportional representation. Now, a key exception to that pattern, of course, is our mother system, the United Kingdom. You'll see that it's up there at 32.2%, which I believe is somewhere down in the 30s there at number 38. You'll see the UK. And the reason the UK is at 32.2% is largely because there are voluntary party quotas. That is, the Labour Party in the UK requires itself to nominate high numbers of women candidates, as do the Liberal Democrats, in competitive constituencies. So that's a very important exception. Major parties in the UK are pressing themselves to nominate women in good seats. Some of you might ask, what about the US House of Representatives since these midterm elections? As of January 2019, the US House of Representatives will have 23.6% women, which is not particularly good, but it is better than the current level of 19.3%. So the US will remain behind Canada, even after a major mobilization that we saw this fall by the Democrats to oppose President Trump and his agenda in the midterm elections. Finally, I just want to point out that if we look at advanced industrial systems like Canada's, we know that countries with proportional representation, either pure or mixed, these are countries that tend to have much higher percentages, not just of women representatives, but also higher levels of voter turnout. So I want to point out that this idea about getting people to vote is also related to the agenda of people who want to see a change in the electoral system, because of a sense that we're not seeing that many people participate in elections in Canada, whether municipally or provincially or federally. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
So my name's Frank Grossman. By training and inclination, I'm a mathematician, an applied statistician and economist, an actuary by another name, very much involved with Citizens Climate Lobby. So when we talk about emissions and greenhouse gases and carbon taxes, I'm speaking for Citizens Climate Lobby. But when we move beyond that to electoral reform writ large, I'm speaking on my own account. Thank you to Member Koto and his team for convening this event. To my mind, there isn't anything as important as our democratic institutions on Tuesday night television. And it's important that we're all here, and I'm glad to see the turnout. 10 years ago, I moved to the States, just in time for President Obama's primary run. And I was there for his election first time and second time. And I returned to Canada a few years ago with some relief. And I was, however, quite disappointed to see the erosion, or the apparent erosion, in our democratic institutions in that brief period that I'd been away. Federally, provincially, local government. Certainly the media has a role to play, but it isn't only that. It's the tone, it's the apparent lack of substance, and it's definitely issues of voice and engagement which have been raised, and clearly the advent of a winner-takes-all mentality. I don't think that was there to the same extent 10 years ago. I'll show some cards right now. I think first past the post has worked tolerably well in the past. It's our tradition. I believe in the Hippocratic Oath. First, don't do any harm. Our electoral system, our democratic institutions are complex and interrelated. And you want to be very, very careful, I think, when tinkering, especially when we're talking about uncontrolled experiments for the scientists in the room. It's very hard to say what will happen with certainty if we change something about our system. We might make a prediction, we might make an inference, but it's important to have good comparators and to go in with our eyes open, because nothing is assured, to my view. Regarding first past the post, and I said just a second ago that it's worked tolerably well, to my view. It has been our tradition, the Westminster tradition in Canada, for roughly 150 years, and probably even goes back a little bit earlier as well, into the period of the struggle for reform or responsible government midway through the 19th century, at least here in Upper Canada. And again, to my view, I don't think it has led to tyranny. We haven't elected tyrants. We certainly haven't re-elected tyrants. And I think the question that I've got about first past the post, is it fundamentally a flawed method per se? Or is it one that has been just degraded in the most recent years, in the last few years? Which is to say, in other words, was first past the post healthier 50 years ago, let's say, than it is today? So are we talking about a systemically flawed approach? Is that what we're really talking about? Or we're talking about an approach that, interacting with other aspects of our democratic institutions, our polity, the way we share information and disinformation, that is suffered thereby? I see that as being something quite different. Are we talking about like a tool that's broken? A broken spoon? Or are we talking about a spoon that's just not working very well right now? For whatever reason. Maybe we turn the lights out and it's hard to use a spoon. You can't find the soup bowl. Whereas before the lights were on and you could find the soup bowl. So is the tool fundamentally broken? Or is it how it's working right now? I'll leave off there and look forward to the discussion.
Discussion this evening. So I have a few questions here, but I don't want to limit the discussion just to the questions I have. So if you want to go off into a different area. But the first question is specifically around the pros and cons, the benefits that First Past the Post has brought forward over the, I guess the history of this country, and some of the problems that it's caused. And we heard a few of those issues, but maybe we can spend a few minutes on that specifically. And I know a couple of people gave some really good examples, but if there are other examples that you could bring forward, I would appreciate that. We'll just open up the microphone, and anyone who would like to speak, just please go ahead.
In terms of First Past the Post as the traditional system, oftentimes it favors the tradition. It favors those who perhaps understand the system the best, maybe have incumbency within the system, and then we just sort of repeat and repeat and repeat, and we don't necessarily have the opportunity to allow new ideas and new people, new faces to emerge that could develop our democracies in a wonderful way. Changing the system could also change the face of who represents us. And that needs to change. If we look at Toronto City Council, historically it has not reflected the diversity within this population that's, you know, vibrant and vast. We've seen actually where people drop out of our local races because they feel as if they are not going to make it past a certain point. So I do think that we have changed as a society, and our voting system does warrant another look.
Well, I think some people can anticipate what my answer to this question will be. No, there's no defenses of our current system. You know, it's great. You know, if you're not into democracy, fantastic. Right? Current system is what you want, because it really makes it tough for Canadians to get the democracy that they want. I think Canadians are democratic, and I think that they struggle to make our system democratic. Institutions of themselves are not democratic or undemocratic. It's the question of whether they're doing the job. And to figure that out, we have to figure out what people are trying to do. The voting system is like a communication device. It's communicating through our political system what voters would like to see. And right now, ours is like a funhouse mirror. You know, the reflection that it gives back of the public does not reflect what the public voted for. I mean, in this last provincial election, it's like a poster child for everything that's wrong with first past the post, right? I mean, you know, 20% of the electorate said they wanted Liberal candidates. They did not get 20% of the seats. They got half as many votes as the Conservatives, but got 1/10 as many seats as the Conservatives. That is not what Ontario voters intended with their votes. So, now, at this point, there will be an interjection about how voting is about the local area and it's about the local politician and all this other sort of Mr. Smith goes to Washington stuff. And you know, I realize I'm fighting a losing battle with politicians trying to convince them that the voters aren't really voting for you. I mean, I realize that goes against what you experience, right? Because they all come up and they give you a hug and they tell you how they love you, and they do. But that is what we call an ecological fallacy. Because what you need to understand is what is going on with the electorate as a whole, not the tiny, tiny group that you have contact with, not the tiny, tiny group that contacts you or come to your office. I'm not against all that stuff. Keep up the good work. I'm sure that you're helping people. But what we know is that people are voting party. We know this through a number of different means, right? Where there aren't parties, voter turnout plummets because people have difficulty getting the information they need to participate. We know that people vote party even when they say they don't, right? A great study asked people, it went out and said, hey, when it's time to vote, what's important to you, right? Is voting for the individual important? 40% of respondents said yes, really important. Then the researcher said, yes, but what if the individual isn't with the party that you want? Now only 4% of the respondents were prepared they'd vote for the individual. In other words, a lot of talk about how much they love the individual is post-hoc rationalizations for the party choice that they already support. You know, I'm a liberal, let's say, I'm not really, but let's say I were, right? And Mitzi's fantastic, I love Mitzi, right? Well, the fact that I'm a liberal probably makes me, you know, want to like Mitzi more, right? And I'm sure that her own personal qualities are important as well. But I'm saying that if we look at what voters are voting for, it's clearly party. Another test, how many individuals get elected without a party? Zero, right? Very rarely does someone at the provincial or federal level get elected without a party. John Nunziata, you might say, yeah, former party guy, right? So the individuals who get elected without parties are formerly connected with parties. So that's a powerful argument that our system should reflect the fundamental thing that our voters are saying with their votes, and that is that they're voting parties. And I just want to come back very quickly to a couple of points that you raised just at the beginning, which is about tradition. The tradition of first past the post is not democracy, right? The origins of first past the post are in the pre-democratic era. It has feudal origins. If you come into a game, if you set the rules of the game, you have advantages over the people who come to the game later. If we go back in Canadian history, the struggle for responsible government was not a struggle for democracy. It was a struggle for a liberal order, for a liberal and a small L, governing order. It was not about democracy. And the struggle for democracy is something else. The people who want democracy come into a system that's already set up to benefit certain people. And that gives those people already in the system a distinct advantage. I'll also add this, we have lots of other traditions. For 35 years in this country, we use proportional voting in Manitoba and Alberta. Literally millions of Canadians have used proportional voting systems at the provincial level. Right? They use the PR system for the urban areas, and they use the alternative vote, ranked ballot, for the rural areas. And the claims or the concerns about the kind of things that would emerge did not emerge in those cases. In fact, everything worked pretty darn well. Why'd they get rid of it? Politics, my friends. We come back to politics. So, again, I think that there's lots of measures, lots of ways in which we could try to approach this question. But I think the most important is that we ask ourselves, what are voters trying to do with their vote, and how best can we manifest that in a democratic way?
I'll go back to some of the political science justifications for first past the post. And one of them that was offered by the late Alan Cairns, a very distinguished Canadian political scientist. Alan Cairns reminded us all that the argument that advocates of first past the post often make is that it generates stable majority governments time after time. But Cairns' own research showed that actually Canada has had a lot of minority governments, both provincially and occasionally at the federal level as well. And so sometimes we forget that the explanations that are trotted out for what is are actually not that related to what is. In other words, there's a gap between the sort of idealized version of why we have a set of rules and what they actually produce. Which reminds me that in political science, as Professor Cairns once pointed out at a conference I attended, there's a tendency to treat our political traditions like a piece of furniture that you want to keep burnishing and polishing because you just love the old stuff. But at the end of the day, democratic systems like ours that are receiving large numbers of newcomers every year really have to respond to the contemporary society. They can't be just like pieces of furniture that we keep polishing because we've fallen in love with the past or with some idealized version of it. Moreover, I think we need to point out that our first past the post system is working in a Westminster parliamentary arrangement where there are very, very high concentrations of power. Folks, we don't have the separation of powers that the United States has, and we all know about their separation of powers and how it's working lately, at least until this new House of Representatives is sworn in. But we do know that our political executive at the provincial and federal levels, particularly when there's a majority government, it's controlling a cabinet, a legislature, it's controlling judicial appointments, it's controlling the senior bureaucracy. I mean, it's really, it's got its tentacles across the system. So I think we need to bear in mind, that our first past the post merged with the high concentrations of power that we've seen in Westminster parliamentary systems like ours is really not at all democratic in the sense of ensuring checks and balances. The argument that was proposed, and I quote, "We have not elected tyrants," I believe is a highly contestable proposition. Okay? I look at it as a testable political science proposition. Sir, I'm not sure if you lived in Ontario after 1995. I don't know the dates of your visit to the United States. But we've certainly at the federal level and at the provincial level here in Ontario, we have had political executives who have insisted that they're giving power to the people. But we know in pure statistical terms that they are giving power to a minority of voters who voted for candidates for their party. And moreover, we need to bear in mind that our electoral system vastly distorts constituency sizes. We need to bear in mind that the constituencies that we now have municipally, provincially, federally in this province are massive, right? There's generally more than 100,000 people living in the urban constituencies, far fewer in rural ones. And if you look across Canada, the weight that we as urban voters have is extremely light, right? If Prince Edward Island, God bless the island, but if it's guaranteed 4 seats as a floor in the British North America Act, you can imagine that PEI's 4 seats, even at the peak of the summer holidays, are often below the population of one constituency in the GTA federally. So my point is here, if small towns and rural areas are highly overrepresented in our electoral systems, provincially and federally, then we've got a lot of problems, a lot of distortions, a lot of less than democratic perfection in our existing system. So I point out that there is a lot of status quo advocacy in discussions of electoral reform that really confuse, I think, dreams with reality. Thank you.
I feel bad, Frank. We've got 2 political science professors and an elected official, and you're the mathematician. So, but, you know, again, let's give him a big round of applause for being here and holding, yeah. Thank you for being here.
Not yet begun to fight. You'll note I positioned myself with my back to the wall. It has some sense. Well, thank you. Good points. But there's more to the story, I think. When we talk about democracy and whether democracy and what is democracy, I mean, it's really, that's the question. What is it? We might be able to say that things are more democratic or less democratic, but to be able to point to any particular structure or process or institution and say, yes, that in itself is democratic, I'll say when and for how long. I'm not in favor of unqualified acceptance and maintenance of traditions per se. We always need to cast a critical eye on the historical baggage and decide what's worth carrying forward and what's worth leaving behind. Absolutely.
If I can just jump in here for a moment. Sometimes the discussion of electoral reform sounds like alphabet soup, you know, with all these different letters and who knows what. I mean, I think we have to start with first principles. Are we concerned about voter turnout? Yeah. What's going to make the system simpler? What's going to make it meaningful? So I think that what we probably want as a country is some mixture of a local representative and then some larger representation for big ideas. So I bring to your attention, for example, the Assembly in London, England, that was brought in after the Labour Party won in 1997, which has a combination of constituency or ward-based members and then London-wide representatives. And the race for London-wide is largely based on issues. People who want public transport, people who want environmental stuff looked after, people who are concerned about ethnocultural diversity and representing that in their local council. So sometimes it's worth thinking about a split ballot where you have geographical representation and then you also have big issue representation. I personally believe that mandatory voting is an excellent idea. I think in Australia, very, very few people have gone to jail. A lot of people say, oh, it won't work in Canada. How many people have to go to jail? Actually, if you look in Australia, lots of people vote. And if you look at the upper house in Australia, where there are more proportional rules in place, there's something like 41% women, way more than in the lower house. So even if you take the same country and you impose different rules, you can see very different outcomes.
Being at the table matters, okay? You want diverse representation, you want diverse policies. If you're not at the table, you don't get them. Those are the facts, okay? That's what's backed up by research. So it really does matter that our legislatures and our parliaments look the way the Canadians look, that they reflect the demographic and the financial differences that exist amongst us, because it matters that people are there, and not because Spumoni can't represent some other flavor of ice cream, but that Spumoni will be influenced by the diversity that is around the table. That's why being present matters. So having more people, more diversity, having our things reflective is crucially important. Why does PR do better? PR does better because it creates incentives for parties to work towards reflecting those differences, because PR is more competitive. A really good example is New Zealand, right? New Zealand switched from first past the post to the MMP form of PR. The results for Indigenous people have been very exciting. They have gone from a dramatic underrepresentation of their Indigenous people to an absolute proportional representation consistent from about the second or third election on. So that is remarkable. And not just before that, it was one party that typically represented Indigenous peoples, the left-wing party. After the introduction of PR created an incentive for all parties to want to get an Indigenous representative, which then actually reflected the diversity of views amongst Indigenous people themselves, who of course were not just of one mind. So I do think that if we use an evidence-based approach, we come up with a much better way to analyze where the problems are and what the solutions might be.
If every party imposed on itself voluntary quotas that required parties to field candidate slates across the federal or provincial constituencies that look like the population of this country, we wouldn't have to debate about how we need to change the electoral system in order to get more of a mirror representation. Younger voters know that, and voters from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, including women, know that that's the case. We know that parties that have imposed quotas on themselves, I take the federal New Democrats as an example, they've had a caucus of roughly 40% women for quite some time because they imposed rules on themselves beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. So you don't need to change the electoral system. As voters, we simply need to force parties to actually get out from under the argument that says that they're looking at pure merit. Because like the US Republicans, the argument for pure merit historically produces a caucus that looks like the US Republicans. It's all older white guys, and they're the ones who seem to know really what merit is.
But Sylvia, that begs the question about why it takes so long to get those results in first past the post. And you're absolutely right. If we could snap our fingers and just morally make them do it, it would work. The reason that it happens faster in PR is the competitive aspect, right? That because smaller groups, weaker groups can influence at least one major party in the political system and then create a contagion effect across the system. So you're absolutely right. Our system is not an absolute barrier. It's just a lot slower. You know, we started off our conversation with a suggestion that our current systems work great and that our country's pretty great and things have been pretty good. Well, that's very much in the eye of the beholder, right? The people who win tend to say that. The people who benefited from the system tend to think the system's pretty good. You know, the people who have been caught underfoot are not, right? So indigenous people who were, you know, suffering through terrible situations in the 19th century and the 20th century might not have the same view. Asian Canadians who had their voting rights stripped from them may not agree that the system works so great. You know, there's lots and lots of examples in Canadian history of some pretty terrible stuff that might have been tempered by a system that didn't award executive power and legislative power in quite so tight a relationship. But what I can say is this, that if we look at Western industrialized countries that are comparable to Canada and we look at the kinds of results that they produce over time and we look at the way that their citizens respond, they seem pretty happy with the kinds of results that those systems produce. They react to our system with horror. Why would you do it that way? That sounds silly. Now, not surprisingly, Canadians say similar things about our system. So really, it depends. I mean, I think that what you can say is that PR systems can be shown to work. They can be shown to be successful. They can, you know, so in that sense, you're asking me, you know, what does the evidence say? The evidence shows that, you know, Canada, the US, and the UK have produced pretty good economies. So have Western industrialized countries with PR. So now we get back to the question, what style of governments, what style of representation, what process, what way of doing politics would we like to see more of?
I think the question that was asked about the relationship between the numbers of women in government, the quality of government, and the quality of life, we can see in Northern European countries of the Nordic region, large numbers of women in political executives, large numbers of women in parliament, consistently high rankings on the UN livability measures. But we also know that there's also very high tax rates. Those countries don't sit next to the United States. So I ask you, how many people would run for office in Canada and promote levels of tax that we might see in Denmark or Sweden or Norway? So where we are in the world also matters, and the values that we have embedded in our social policy. We are what's known as the residual or liberal welfare state. We are not running the egalitarian social systems that we see in many Nordic countries. And we have different values coming out of British traditions that helped to found, in particular, English Canada. So I'm certainly not a person who believes that if you change the electoral system, we will be living in the Nordic world. And I do certainly believe that voter turnout is a serious problem. That's why I pointed out in my introductory remarks that proportional representation systems do tend, that are liberal democratic, with a long history like Canada's, do tend to have higher rates of voter turnout than ours, and it's something I am very concerned about, the quality of our institutions, particularly voter turnout among younger Canadians.
Complications of the voting systems. Again, how do we understand simplicity? Well, PR is simplicity. The results are very easy to understand. Go out in the street right now and ask somebody how Justin Trudeau turned 39% of the popular vote into 60% of the seats. I'll wait, right? Very few people could explain to you how that occurred, okay? People nowhere understand the mechanics of the voting systems that they use. What they understand is how to use the ballot to get the results that they want. And we know this is the case because we can look at things like ballot spoilage, right? Ballot spoilage tells us if people are having too much difficulty using the ballot. And in fact, ballot spoilage rates are very low across both PR and first-past-the-post countries. On voter turnout, yes, the evidence is that voter turnout is higher in PR countries than in first-past-the-post, though voter turnout is falling across all political systems. So it's not just the voting system. PR may help, but it won't limit exactly. Policy lurch. Why don't we have the policy lurch in PR? Because one party can't rip stuff out and get away with it, right? They've got to get more people involved, which means they've got to build a bigger coalition. It takes a little longer to make policy, but the policy has roots. It's got legs because it has a broader base to stand on. My last point. I think a lot of this comes down to the Liberal Party of Ontario. And what kind of party is the Liberal Party? And I think it's a party divided. Right? It's a party divided between its traditional roots in social justice and its sense of liberality, creating a less oppressive world, more inclusive world. But at the same time, the Liberal Party has had strong links to Bay Street. And so that has created a number of contradictions for the party in terms of moving forward on both those fronts at the same time. The decision is coming for the Liberal Party. You are going to have to choose. We are going to live through a very extreme government over the next few years, one that is going to rent the fabric of this province. And Liberals are going to have to ask themselves, are you going to be part of putting together a new kind of politics for Ontario? And a proportional system would not just serve Ontario, but I think it would also serve the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party is a distinct party. It does offer a vision of progressive politics that is different than the NDP, and Ontario would benefit from keeping them both. But first past the post makes it hard for Ontarians to have both, and that's wrong. So I'm putting it out there that Liberals have got work to do in the years ahead to decide which side are you on, because I think that if you take leadership on this issue, it will make a difference.
I do want to say that the politics, and I believe, Dennis, you started off by talking about that, often gets in the way of the reform. And until we get to that stage where there is that desire from people to see the system change, we're not going to see that system on a federal and provincial level to the extent that we want to see it. I would say that Ontario has been progressive under the Liberals to attempt to bring in electoral reform at the local level. It's now there, hasn't yet been ripped away. An actual municipality has actually run with that change and to good result. One of the areas that they could have focused a bit more on was on education and letting people know what the new system is about and how to engage in it. But there's nothing like running an election for people to actually wake up to the change, and they are hopeful for years out. Let's take the fear out of the change. Because I was part of the Citizens Assembly. I did see how difficult it was for people to imagine that system here, having been so used to a party system that they feel they understand, that they feel they can control the ballot, to give that up for something new. I felt that at the local level, that was a smaller step, and we can begin to accept electoral reform and change in Ontario by starting there.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, Sylvia, Dennis, Mitzi. Thank you so much for being here. I thought this was a great conversation. It's what an incredible conversation. I would say this is probably one of the best discussions we've had in all my years holding these types of talks in this very room. So I really, really appreciate it. There is an appetite out there for change, regardless of if people agree on one side or the other. They do believe that we're not engaging people properly, and we need to change the system in order to get more participation from the citizen. once you start talking about the history of the system, where it came from, and the ownership, and my key message always is don't let people speak for you. You know, be part of the conversation. When young people come to the legislature, I always ask them one question, because we do get groups of young people coming through. I ask every single group this one question. So imagine on the stairs, there's about 100 young people standing there, usually 2 or 3 classrooms. And I ask them the one question, who owns this building? And it really, first they start off, they say Justin Trudeau, the Queen, you know, Doug Ford. They'll say all these things, and then there's this one kid at the back and you know, puts his or her hand up and says it's us. You know, but it's after 10 answers. And you think about that, you know, it's funny, but if you really think about it, if you want young people, if you want citizens to believe that, you know, to be engaged in a system, they need to feel like they're part of it, that they own a piece of it. And that's not happening anymore. So I think one of the things that we need to do, I think the idea around, you know, making sure the civics classes are enhanced, I think that's a great idea. But it's not just limited to young people. You know, I got elected with 57% in the previous election. But when you start to do the numbers, that's, you know, if I'm lucky, maybe, 28% of the actual people in the riding? So you can walk around, oh God, almost 60%. But it's really like 20. So I remind myself, every single time I knock at a door, you know, it's usually 3 people out of 10 people who supported me with my majority. So you've got to remind yourself the way the thing, you know, the way the math really works, because it's not really reflective of the reality. I just want to say thank you so much. This has been great, and on behalf of all the residents of Don Valley East, thank you for your time. You're all busy people. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.